In the quiet hours before dawn, a man stumbled into a rural police station in Vermont, shivering, disoriented, and clutching a torn leather satchel. He claimed he had just escaped from another Earth. Not a metaphor, not a dream. He described an entire world eerily like ours, yet marked by subtle, impossible differences. The officer on duty assumed he was drunk or delirious, but the man's story was so detailed, so precise, that even the most skeptical listener would hesitate before dismissing him. His account would eventually vanish from official records, living on only in whispers, conspiracy forums, and the few who still remember his haunted eyes. It began, like most strange stories do, in a place where no one was looking. On the night of March 12, 2019, a man stepped into a police station in a small Midwestern city and claimed that he had just escaped from another Earth, one that looked almost exactly like ours, but wasn't. His name was recorded as Daniel R. on the incident report, but whether that was truly his name is still unknown. The attending officers described him as wet, exhausted, and terrified, as though he'd been running for hours. His clothes were ordinary, jeans, shirt, trench coat, but all bore tags in a language no one recognized. Not quite Cyrillic, not quite Greek. The characters curved in strange ways, like they'd been designed by someone who had heard of English letters but never seen them. Daniel claimed he had arrived in this version of Earth only 30 minutes earlier. He didn't remember the exact point where the worlds had shifted, only that he had been walking home from work when the air rippled and the colours around him changed. "It's the smells that hit you first," he told officers. "Your world smells different, cleaner, sharper, and the sky, it's the wrong shade of blue." He reached into his satchel and placed several items on the desk. A black notebook filled with more of the strange writing. A small metallic cube warm to the touch that emitted a faint hum. And a photograph of what appeared to be Daniel, standing next to a building that didn't exist anywhere in our records. A tall, twisting tower made entirely of glass, located in a city skyline no one could identify. When questioned further, Daniel insisted that in his world, the year was not 2019, but 2021. And that his Earth had no internet, no airplanes, and no fossil fuels. Instead, they used a form of resonance travel, moving between points by manipulating vibrations in the air. The officers naturally suspected drugs or mental illness. They ran his fingerprints. No matches. They checked his ID card, which was a thin, flexible strip of transparent plastic etched with that same alien script. Scanning it under UV light revealed what looked like a map of an unknown continent. Then came the most unsettling part. When they attempted to call the number listed on the ID, the line connected, but instead of a ringing tone, they heard the sound of rushing wind, followed by a deep rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of something impossibly large. Daniel's expression when they played it back, pure dread. "It's found me," he whispered. "I don't have much time before it opens again." The officers exchanged glances, unsure if they were dealing with a frightened man or a skilled hoaxer. But later, when reviewing the station's security footage, they noticed something they couldn't explain. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the moment Daniel had entered the lobby, the cameras had flickered for 3 full seconds, showing not the police station, but a dimly lit room filled with moving shadows and walls covered in the same strange writing. No one could explain the glitch. No one tried. But it was only the beginning of Daniel's story. The interview began at 12:18 a.m. 2 officers, Detective Harris and Sergeant Cole, sat across from Daniel, their voices calm, their questions methodical. But from the moment the recorder clicked on, the atmosphere shifted. Daniel seemed distracted, his gaze drifting to the corners of the room as though expecting to see something standing there. They started with the basics. Where was he from? What had happened? Why had he come here? Daniel's answers were never rushed, but they came with an urgency, as if every second wasted was 1 second closer to something finding him. "I'm from a place you would call Erevoth," he said slowly, enunciating each syllable. "It is not another country. It is parallel, layered next to yours. If you were to tear a page from a book and slide it against another, that is how close our worlds are. But they are not the same story." Detective Harris asked what he meant by layered. Daniel hesitated, then placed his palm flat on the table. "Here," he said, "things move in straight lines, forward or back, cause, effect. But in my Earth, movement is different. Time bends in on itself, places shift, and sometimes—" He trailed off, glancing at the metallic cube. "Sometimes the layers touch." The cube, he explained, was a resonance key, a tool designed to create small, temporary openings between layers. In Erevoth, these keys were used for transportation within their own world, but occasionally, and dangerously, they could connect to foreign layers, places never meant to intersect. "That's how I got here," he said, "by accident, and it wasn't supposed to be possible anymore." When asked why, Daniel's hands clenched. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Because something started crossing over, something that doesn't belong to either side." His description was fragmented, part physical, part impossible. "It has weight without shape, sound without a mouth, and when it comes, colours drain from the air." Sergeant Cole exchanged a skeptical glance with Harris, but continued the questioning. "So you're saying you were running from this thing?" Daniel nodded. "It followed me from a place I wasn't meant to be. It marked me. If I don't stay ahead of it, it will overwrite me, like a word on a page replaced by another." The tension in the room thickened. Rain hammered harder against the windows, the storm's growl seeping into the interview. Daniel's voice began to falter, as though he were reliving each moment. He described his last hours in Erevoth, walking home through streets lit by tall glass spires, hearing a sound like a low, vibrating chord in the air. People stopped moving. Cars froze in place, their engines silent. And then, from between two buildings, a shimmer, like heat on asphalt, widened into a rift. "I knew better than to look," Daniel said, "but I did, and it saw me." When asked what happened next, he reached into the notebook and tore out a page. On it was a crude drawing, a figure not made of flesh or bone, but of shifting negative space, outlined by faint white lines that resembled static. The officers studied it. "And you think this thing is here?" Harris asked. Daniel didn't blink. "I don't think, I know, because I can feel the pressure in the air. It's already searching." As if on cue, the lights in the interview room flickered. The cube on the table gave a single low pulse of sound. Behind the one-way mirror, the monitoring equipment glitched. For exactly 1.7 seconds, the video feed displayed a different room entirely. One with smooth, metallic walls and a floor that reflected the ceiling like a mirror. No one moved inside, but faint rhythmic thumps echoed from somewhere beyond the camera's view. When the feed returned, Daniel was staring directly at the camera, his expression unreadable. By 3:07 a.m., Daniel was being processed for holding, not as a criminal, but as a person of interest. The metallic cube and other items were catalogued, photographed, and stored in the evidence room, but the officers assigned to the case were uneasy. The interview had left them with more questions than answers, and the strange technical anomalies, the camera glitch, the cube's sound, had lingered like a bad aftertaste. Detective Harris, a 14-year veteran of the force, couldn't let it go. While the storm raged, he sat alone at his desk, turning the notebook page by page. At first glance, it seemed like nonsense, symbols and drawings that might have been the work of an eccentric artist. But the longer he stared, the more he felt the patterns pushing at the edges of his comprehension, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to form. The diagrams seemed to depict overlapping landscapes, one labelled with faint English place names that matched locations on Earth, London, New York, Kyoto, and another set with words that meant nothing to him, Thalsair, Ivrenloch, Drossel Point. The two maps were connected by fine lines, each line marked with geometric figures. He noticed something else. Under UV light, faint impressions appeared between the drawn lines, almost like fingerprints pressed into the paper itself. But the whorls didn't match human prints. They were too precise, too symmetrical. Meanwhile, in the evidence room, Officer Latham was logging the cube into the system when the bag began to fog on the inside, as if the object was radiating cold. He placed it on the shelf, but before he could walk away, the cube gave a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the metal shelving. The sound was brief, almost imperceptible, but it left the officer's teeth aching. He returned to his desk without mentioning it. Back in the holding area, Daniel sat alone in a corner cell. There were no cameras inside, just one outside the bars. But at 3:26 a.m. the feed recorded something unusual. The shadows in the cell began to stretch unnaturally toward Daniel, converging at his feet. He looked down at them, whispered something, and the shadows snapped back into place as though nothing had happened. Harris finally closed the notebook, rubbing his temples. He couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols weren't just drawings, they were instructions, a set of coordinates not for places in our world, but for points in whatever parallel layer Daniel had come from. He picked up his phone and called Sergeant Cole. "I want a linguistics expert in here tomorrow, someone who specializes in constructed languages." Cole's voice on the other end was tight. "You're assuming it's a language." "I'm assuming," Harris replied, "that it's not random, and if Daniel's telling the truth, it could be our only warning." As Harris hung up, the lamp on his desk flickered. In the momentary darkness, he swore he saw something reflected in the window. Not his own face, but a taller, thinner silhouette standing behind him. When the light steadied, the reflection was gone. But Harris found himself glancing over his shoulder for the rest of the night. By morning, Detective Harris's unease had hardened into obsession. The metallic cube sat in its sealed bag in the evidence room, but something was wrong. The chain of custody log showed no entries overnight, yet the bag was wrinkled, as if someone had gripped it tightly. Harris asked the night guard about it, but the man swore no one had been in the room. He didn't believe him. At 9:12 a.m, Dr. Evelyn Ross arrived. Harris had pulled strings to get her here. She was one of the few people in the country who studied not only ancient scripts, but also constructed languages invented by small, obscure cultures, some lost to history. She began with the notebook, flipping through the pages in silence. "This isn't any language I've seen," she said finally. "But there are rules. Look here, repeating structures, consistent syntax. Whoever wrote this wasn't doodling, they were recording something precise. This is navigational." "Navigational?" Harris asked. Ross nodded. "These patterns here, they're positional markers. Think of them like coordinates, but they're not lat long. These don't map to Earth. If I had to guess, they map to somewhere else entirely." Somewhere else. The words hung in the air. While they spoke, Harris noticed Ross kept glancing toward the notebook as if it were moving. At one point she froze, staring at a page. "Did you see that?" she asked. "See what?" "The symbol here. It just changed." Harris leaned over. The symbol in question, a diamond shape intersected by a spiral, was subtly different from the photograph taken just hours earlier. The spiral was now longer, curling into itself in a way that suggested depth, as though it were a tunnel rather than a line. The station's overhead lights flickered. A low hum began to emanate from somewhere down the hall. Harris stood, moving toward the sound. It was coming from the evidence room. When he and Ross arrived, they found the cube pulsing faintly, as though lit from within. The hum deepened until they could feel it in their bones. Then, without warning, the cube went silent, its surface perfectly still. Ross turned pale. "This isn't just an artifact, it's active." Back in the interview room, Daniel was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, whispering to himself. The camera feed picked up the words, "They've found the door. It's not locked anymore." Later, Harris would replay that clip dozens of times, trying to decipher whether it was a threat, a warning, or both. By the end of the day, Ross had filled pages with rough translations. Certain repeated sequences seemed to refer to passages, gates, and mirrors. Others described thin days when the barrier between worlds grew weak. She warned Harris that if the cube was indeed a key, or worse, a beacon, then keeping it in the station might be the worst thing they could do. That night, as Harris drove home, his headlights briefly caught movement on the side of the road. A tall, thin figure standing perfectly still, its face obscured by shadow. When he slowed to look, the figure was gone. He didn't tell anyone. It was almost midnight when Harris got the call. Deputy Malone's voice was tense. "You're going to want to see this for yourself." By the time Harris arrived, the scene was surreal. The livestock fence was shattered in one section, not as though it had been hit, but as if the metal posts had been softened and bent by heat. Beyond it, a perfect circle had been burned into the pasture, the grass reduced to blackened ash. At its center was the hole. It wasn't just a pit, it was too round, its edges smooth and glistening, the dirt hardened into a glossy surface like cooled volcanic glass. From inside came a faint, steady glow, cycling through shades Harris couldn't name. The light shifted in a way that felt alive. Malone stepped closer, keeping his flashlight steady. We sent a probe down on a cable, just a GoPro with lights. You'll want to see what it caught. Back at the patrol car, they watched the feed. The camera descended about 15 feet before the dirt walls abruptly ended. Not in more soil, but in open air. A vast, cavernous space stretched beyond, filled with drifting particles like illuminated dust motes. Structures, angular, metallic, and massive, loomed in the distance. The GoPro's light caught what looked like a vertical sheet of liquid, rippling gently despite the still air. Then the feed went black. No signal after that, Malone said. Cable came back cut clean through. Before Harris could respond, one of the cows let out a terrified bellow. They turned toward the sound in time to see the herd surging away from the hole. A thin mist had begun to pour from it, moving with unnatural speed, curling against the wind. It slid across the ground like water, pooling around their boots. That's when Harris heard it. A low, resonant hum, just like the one from the cube the day before. It was stronger now, vibrating in his chest. He realized the sound wasn't just from the hole, it was coming from everywhere. Malone swore under his breath. Feels like the air's buzzing. Then came the whisper. It wasn't in English, it wasn't even a sound. More like an idea pushed into Harris's mind, a string of symbols that matched those in Daniel's notebook. His vision swam for a moment, and he thought he saw the landscape tilt, the moon in the sky elongating into a pale oval. The glow from the hole pulsed brighter, and for an instant Harris saw movement deep inside. A tall, impossibly thin silhouette crossing the cavern floor. It turned, as if it knew it was being watched, and then, as quickly as it had begun, the light dimmed. The mist receded back into the hole. The hum faded. When they dared to approach again, the hole was still there, but the glow was gone. It was just darkness now. Harris didn't sleep that night. He replayed the GoPro footage again and again, and each time in the moment before the feed cut out, he thought he could hear something faint, like footsteps echoing in a place far too big to be under a farm in the middle of Kansas. The next morning, Daniel sat calmly in his cell, looking almost relieved. "Told you the doors open on thin nights," he said. "Now they'll come looking for the one who brought the key here." Harris didn't ask what he meant. He was starting to understand. The morning after the hole appeared, the town woke to a fog that hadn't been in the forecast. It wasn't heavy enough to obscure the streets, but it clung low, sliding along the ground like it was following invisible channels. People noticed its odd shimmer, how it seemed to glow faintly when the sun hit it at the right angle. Harris had been up all night, but the reports flooding in made sleep impossible anyway. A farmer on the outskirts claimed he'd seen columns of light flickering in his wheat, like someone set up a dozen spotlights and forgot to turn them off. A school bus driver reported that her dashboard instruments went dead when she passed the south pasture. By the time she reached town, they came back online as if nothing had happened. The strangest call came from Mrs. Lindemann, the elderly librarian. She insisted she'd been woken by voices in the fog, not loud, not even distinct, but clear enough to convince her she wasn't alone in her house. When Harris drove out to her place, she pointed toward the tree line. The fog pooled thickest there, rippling slightly, almost as though breathing. The hum was faint, but present, a soft resonance that made the air feel heavier. Back at the sheriff's office, Harris played the GoPro footage for a few deputies. None of them spoke until it ended. One finally muttered, "That wasn't dirt down there. Whatever that was, it wasn't this place." Before Harris could reply, the lights flickered. Phones rang simultaneously. Different residents reporting the same thing. Their clocks were wrong, not just off by minutes, but by hours. One man claimed his kitchen clock had jumped ahead 3 days in an instant. Then came the power outage. For 12 seconds, every light, every appliance in town went dead. In the silence that followed, the hum swelled, loud enough now to rattle window panes. Harris stepped outside and froze. The fog had thickened into tendrils rising higher than before, winding between the buildings. Within it, shapes flickered, tall, narrow, and moving with deliberate slowness. They didn't walk. They shifted, like frames of film missing in between movements. When Harris blinked, the shapes were gone, but the fog remained. That afternoon, Sheriff Klein called an emergency meeting at the community centre. Dozens of townsfolk packed inside, muttering anxiously. Harris stood by the back wall, scanning faces. He noticed Daniel among them, still in his orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed. Apparently, Klein thought bringing him might get answers. Daniel's gaze wasn't on the sheriff. It was fixed on the fog curling outside the tall windows. When Harris caught his eye, Daniel smiled faintly. "It's starting," he said under his breath. "They've found a way to reach through." Klein slammed a hand on the podium. "We're locking down the southern fields. No one goes near that hole. We've contacted state authorities." A sudden, deafening crack interrupted him. The entire building shuddered as though struck by something massive underground. Lights popped, plunging the room into darkness. The hum returned louder than ever, and this time everyone heard it. Not just sound, but words, slipping into their minds in a language none could name, yet all somehow understood. A message, repeated 3 times, each slower than the last. When the lights flickered back on, the fog had poured halfway into the building, and for just a second, caught between the crowd's panic and the return of electric light, Harris thought he saw a figure standing at the centre of the room, impossibly tall, its head brushing the rafters, its form wavering like heat haze. Then the light steadied, and it was gone. The meeting at the community centre had left Harris with more questions than answers. Daniel was taken back into custody, but not before whispering something that refused to leave Harris's mind. They found a way to reach through. It wasn't just the tone, it was the certainty in Daniel's voice, the way he'd spoken as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. When Harris returned to his office, he started digging, not into the fog or the hum, there was nothing official on those, but into the town's older records. Every rural sheriff's department had its archives, usually tucked away in boxes no one bothered to open unless a new deputy was curious. Harris wasn't looking for ghost stories, he was looking for patterns, and he found one. The first entry was from August 14th, 1979. A young man named Michael Trask had vanished from his family's farm, located, Harris noted with unease, just a half mile from where the sinkhole now yawned in the south field. The report was sparse. Trask had been working the fields at dawn. His father stepped inside for coffee, came back out 10 minutes later, and found nothing but his son's boots lying in the wheat. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no explanation. A week later, 2 deputies searched the area and discovered a perfect circle of flattened wheat about 30 feet across. The stalks were bent but not broken, their tips singed as if brushed by heat. State investigators chalked it up to a prank, but the rest of the file told a stranger story. Witness statements collected from nearby farmers described low voices coming from the fog, and a humming that seemed to come from under the ground. One man claimed he'd seen a figure, tall, thin-skinned and shimmering, standing in the centre of the circle. The kicker was in the personal notes of the lead investigator at the time. Scrawled on the back of a map was a single line: "If this happens again, the town will not be ready." Harris leaned back in his chair, the hum still faintly in the air outside. This wasn't the first time. It had happened before, same area, same strange phenomena, and it had ended with someone vanishing without a trace. He sifted through more files and found smaller incidents scattered over the decades, livestock disappearing overnight, power surges that knocked out entire grids, and always the fog. That's when he heard the knock. Deputy Collins stepped in, pale and visibly shaken. "Sir, you need to see this." Harris followed him outside. The fog had begun to retreat from the town centre, curling back toward the southern fields. But where it had passed, it left behind something new. Fine geometric patterns traced in the frost on windows, roofs, and even the asphalt. Perfectly straight lines intersecting at impossible angles, forming shapes that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. Collins muttered, "These weren't here an hour ago." Harris took out his phone to snap photos, but when he checked the screen, the images were distorted, pixelated in strange patterns, as if the phone couldn't decide what it was looking at. "Sir," Collins said again, pointing south. Through the thinning fog, Harris saw movement. Dozens of figures were walking, no, gliding, in unison along the far edge of the field. They were too far to make out details, but their silhouettes were unnaturally tall, their heads slightly bowed. And then, Harris realized something that made his chest tighten. They weren't walking toward the sinkhole, they were walking toward town. The fog at the southern boundary of town wasn't behaving like weather. It was alive, curling, folding in on itself, withdrawing just enough to reveal shapes before swallowing them again. Harris counted the figures, 11, all moving in silent unison, their outlines too tall and thin for comfort. Deputy Collins muttered, "They're getting closer." But Harris noticed something else. The street lamps nearest the fog were flickering in sync with the movement of the figures, dimming slightly with each step. It wasn't random, it was a pattern. As they advanced toward the edge of the populated blocks, townsfolk began spilling out from homes and shops. Some clutched phones, others just stood there, transfixed. Harris barked at them to get inside, but his voice barely carried. It was as if the air itself was muffling sound. Then he saw him, standing in the cold without a coat, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. Samuel Pierce, 83 years old, retired farmer, and one of the last living witnesses from the Michael Trask disappearance in 1979. Pierce's gaze was locked on the fog. "It's the same," he whispered. "The same walk, the same hum. You can feel it in your bones if you stand still long enough." Harris stepped closer. "You were there that morning?" Pierce nodded slowly. "The day Trask went missing, I was up before dawn. Saw the fog roll in over the field. Thought it was just weather until I saw them, shapes in the mist walking in perfect lines. I tried to run toward them, but the ground, it shifted, like the earth wasn't where it was supposed to be." "What happened to Michael?" Harris pressed. The old man's eyes watered. "He was there, in the middle of the circle, just standing. One of them reached out a hand, and when the fog cleared, he was gone. No sound, no light, just gone." Before Harris could ask more, a deep vibration rumbled through the street. Not a sound exactly, but a resonance that seemed to press against the skin. The figures in the fog stopped walking, and then they turned. Every head shifted in unison until all 11 were facing the town directly. Even from a distance, Harris could feel their attention like a physical weight. The frost patterns on nearby windows began to shift again, rearranging into new symbols, tighter, sharper, more intricate. The sheriff's radio crackled, and a panicked voice came through. "We've got reports of power dropping across the south sector. Streetlights are going out one by one." In the distance, Harris saw it too. One by one, the lamps along the southern road were blinking out, starting at the far end and creeping closer. The darkness was following the figures. Pierce tightened his grip on the cane, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't let them cross into the heart of town. Once they pass the old grain silo, it's too late. That's the threshold." Collins looked at Harris, uncertainty in his eyes. "Threshold for what?" The old man's answer was a single, chilling word. "Taking." Before Harris could respond, the fog surged forward, like a tide breaking free of an invisible barrier. The figures moved with it, gliding faster now, their shapes growing sharper against the dim glow of the last working streetlights. Harris felt his instincts scream. Whatever was coming, they weren't ready. The grain silo loomed like a sentinel at the edge of town, its metal sides groaning faintly in the cold wind. Harris positioned 2 squad cars at the base of the access road, their headlights aimed squarely into the fog bank. The light didn't penetrate far, only a few yards, before it was swallowed whole. Deputy Collins barked orders, placing flares in a staggered pattern. The glow should have illuminated the ground, but the light bent strangely, curling inward, as though the fog was bending it away from the town. Samuel Pierce stood off to the side, watching every movement. His eyes tracked the figures moving inside the fog, their pace steady, deliberate. "You don't get it," he muttered. "This isn't about keeping them out. This is about buying time." Harris turned. "Time for what?" Pierce shifted his cane, leaning heavily on it. "Time to figure out who they've come for. They never take at random. There's a reason, always a reason." Harris shook his head. "You make it sound like this has happened before." Pierce's gaze didn't waver from the fog. "It has. 1932, 1956, 1979. And now. He tapped the ground with his cane. Each time someone or some group just vanishes. No bodies, no tracks, no signs they ever existed. And those who remain, he trailed off, his expression hardening. They remember less and less about the ones who are gone. A week later, it's like they never lived here. A flare sputtered and died. The darkness surged forward with alarming speed, swallowing the space where it had burned just moments ago. Harris grabbed his radio. "Unit 2, hold that line, replace the flares." Static hissed back, then a strained voice. "Sheriff, they're inside the perimeter." Harris's gut turned to ice. From the corner of his vision, movement. One of the figures had emerged from the fog, just enough for the light to catch it. Its skin, if that's what it was, reflected the red flare glow in shifting patterns, almost like the frost symbols on the windows. The head tilted unnaturally, the motion too smooth, too intentional. The old man's voice cut through the air. "Don't let them mark you." Harris turned sharply. "Mark me? What does that?" Pierce pointed to the figure. "Watch its hand." Indeed, the elongated fingers were raised slightly, and as it moved, a faint shimmer traced through the air between them and the nearest deputy. It wasn't light, it wasn't smoke. It was as if the space itself was warping, like heat waves over asphalt. The deputy froze mid-step, his eyes going wide. Harris ran toward him, but the man collapsed before he reached him, unconscious, frost spreading rapidly over his jacket. The figure stepped back into the fog without a sound. Pierce's knuckles whitened on his cane. "He's marked now. If we don't get him out of town before dawn," the implication hung heavy in the air. Harris didn't need him to finish the sentence. From deeper in the fog, the other figures began to spread out, moving toward multiple points along the perimeter. Harris realized they weren't just trying to cross into town, they were surrounding it. Collins ran up, panting. "Sheriff, we've got reports. North End, same thing. Fog's there now too." Harris's blood ran cold. If the fog was at both ends, the town was nearly encircled. Pierce's voice dropped to a whisper, but Harris heard it clearly. "This is how it starts. Once the circle closes, there's no way out." By the time Harris reached the north end of Main Street, the fog had advanced another 50 yards. It didn't roll in like natural mist, it pulsed, almost breathing, the edges curling and tightening as though responding to some unheard command. Deputies tried to relay positions over the radio, but the static was worse now. Harsh, grating bursts that made Harris wince. A few words managed to cut through, distorted beyond recognition except for one. "Inside." The last time Harris had felt this helpless was in a blizzard when he was a rookie. But this wasn't nature. Nature didn't coordinate. A long, low hum vibrated through the air. It wasn't coming from the fog itself, but from somewhere within it, steady, resonant, like the hum of high-voltage wires. As it deepened, the streetlights overhead began to flicker in a pattern, not randomly, but in precise intervals. 3 blinks, pause. 3 blinks, pause. Over and over. Samuel Pierce appeared at his side again, moving faster than Harris would have thought possible for his age. "The lights," he said, pointing up. "It's a signal." "To who?" Harris asked, already knowing he didn't want the answer. Pierce's reply was almost drowned out by another burst of static from Harris's radio. "Not who," the old man said grimly. "What?" The fog on the south end shifted suddenly, forming narrow corridors between dense walls. Harris could see shapes inside, too tall, too narrow to be human, sliding silently toward the nearest houses. Residents who'd come out onto their porches froze, transfixed as if caught in a trance. Harris shouted, "Get back inside!" But his voice barely carried. It wasn't that the sound didn't travel. It was as though the fog swallowed it, dampening everything past a few feet. One of the figures emerged halfway into the open, its outline jagged, as though light itself struggled to define it. It stopped beside a wooden fence, raised its hand, and the boards iced over in seconds, the frost spreading in fractal patterns too geometric to be natural. "Sheriff!" Collins sprinted toward him, face pale, breath ragged. "It's everywhere now. The east and west sides too. Whole town's boxed in." Harris's mind raced. "Emergency alert system?" Collins shook his head. "Cell towers are dead. Landlines too. Then from behind them, a woman screamed, a high, ragged sound that cut through the muffled stillness. Harris turned in time to see a man collapse near the diner, his breath crystallizing in the air as frost crawled rapidly up his neck. His eyes darted wildly for a second before freezing open. 2 deputies rushed to him, but Pierce shouted, "Don't touch him!" They hesitated, and in that moment, the fog surged forward, enveloping the man completely. When it receded, the spot where he had lain was empty. No body, no frost, no trace. Harris swallowed hard. What just happened? Pierce's eyes locked on the space where the man had been. Marked, taken, gone. Another flare sputtered out to the south, and the remaining light shrank in on itself, the shadows growing longer. The hum from the fog grew louder, vibrating in Harris's chest. The streetlights blinked again. 3, pause, 3, pause. But now the intervals were quicker, more urgent. "They're closing the circle," Pierce said, voice almost lost in the wind that suddenly whips down the street. "Once it's shut, they choose who stays." "Stays?" Harris asked. Pierce looked at him, and Harris realized the old man's pupils had dilated to pinpricks. "Not everyone here is meant to leave, Sheriff. And not everyone here is from here." Before Harris could ask what he meant, the fog on all 4 sides surged inward, collapsing the last open spaces into a solid wall. The hum reached a deep, chest-rattling note, and then, for the first time, something inside the fog spoke. It wasn't words exactly. It was rhythm. It was numbers. And it was counting down. The sound wasn't like a human voice. It was mechanical, layered, and impossibly deep, yet it resonated directly in the bones of everyone who heard it. 5. Harris didn't just hear the number. He felt it, like a shudder rolling through his chest. He glanced at Pierce, whose eyes were fixed on the wall of fog to the east. 4. The vibration deepened. A street lamp on the corner exploded with a sharp pop, showering glass onto the pavement. The light that replaced it was dimmer, yellowish, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward the fog rather than away from it. 3. Somewhere to the north, a child cried out, the sound strangely muffled. Harris's instincts screamed at him to run toward it, but the dense barrier made the direction almost impossible to pinpoint. He reached for his radio again. Static, nothing more. Pierce gripped his arm. "Don't split up now. That's how they take them faster." 2. The fog pressed closer, so near that Harris could see fine filaments within it. Hair-thin strands of light weaving in patterns, shifting as though aware of being watched. Within those patterns, shapes flickered, tall, narrow figures like the one he had seen earlier. 1. Everything went still. The hum stopped. The streetlights froze mid-flicker. Even the wind seemed to vanish. The silence was absolute. So absolute, Harris could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then the fog surged inward. It didn't roll or drift, it snapped forward, collapsing the space between houses, between streets, in an instant. Where it touched, frost bloomed in symmetrical designs, circles within circles, spirals, angular lattices that resembled circuitry etched in ice. Harris shoved Pierce toward the diner's heavy double doors, calling for Collins and the other deputies to get people inside. Most obeyed, slamming doors, bolting locks, but a few stood rooted in place, staring at the fog as though it was something beautiful. Those were the first to vanish. It happened without a sound. One moment they were there, the next they were simply gone, replaced by perfect frost silhouettes on the pavement, which dissolved seconds later. Harris pushed into the diner, where a dozen townsfolk huddled together. The hum returned, softer this time, almost coaxing. Through the fogged windows, the outside world warped and shifted. Houses looked taller, streets narrower, and the sky took on an oily sheen, rippling with faint green and violet streaks. Pierce leaned in close. "It's not here to kill the whole town. It's here to exchange." "Exchange for what?" Harris demanded. Before Pierce could answer, a shadow moved past the window, human in height but wrong in proportion. It paused, turned toward the glass, and in that instant, Harris felt as though it was looking straight at him. The hum sharpened, becoming a tone so high it made the diner's glass tremble. A plate slid off the counter and shattered. The people inside covered their ears. Then came the voices. Not one voice, dozens. layered and overlapping, speaking in languages Harris didn't recognize. Words rose and fell in hypnotic rhythm. The townsfolk closest to the window began to sway, their eyes glazing over. Pierce grabbed Harris's shoulder. "You can't hold this place. Once the circle's closed, it doesn't matter what's solid, it can pass through anything. We either leave now or we're part of the trade," Harris finished grimly. Another countdown began. The second countdown began, slower this time, but heavier, each number like a hammer blow to the skull. 5. The fog pressed harder against the diner's glass, not swirling but breathing. Filaments of pale blue light pulsed within it, twisting together into shapes that almost resembled symbols, shapes that flickered away before the eye could focus. Harris could feel the weight of those shapes in his mind, like he'd seen them before in a dream he'd forgotten. 4. The sound of it scraped across the brain, not just an audible tone, but a vibration felt in the teeth, the ribs, the soles of the feet. The floor beneath the diner began to thrum, the same strange heartbeat pattern Harris had felt earlier when they first heard the countdown. The ketchup bottles on the tables rattled against the salt shakers. 3. A woman in the corner, maybe late 50s, began muttering under her breath. Harris moved closer, catching fragments of words, half English, half something else. Her eyes were open, but they didn't seem to see the room around her. Her pupils reflected the faintest glimmer of the blue light outside. Pierce noticed too. "It's already inside their heads," he said, low and urgent. 2. From somewhere out in the fog, a sound rose, not a voice, not exactly, but something halfway between a human cry and the groan of metal under immense weight. It stretched on and on, changing pitch, until Harris realized it was responding to the countdown, answering each number like a second participant in some ritual. 1. The fog surged forward again, and this time the glass of the diner bowed inward, not breaking, but flexing, as though the laws of physics had given it permission. The frost that bloomed across it was different now, not random spirals, but deliberate lines, angular and sharp, meeting in perfect intersections. It looked like a map, but not of any terrain Harris recognized. The hum cut off. Silence, then just inches away on the other side of the glass, it appeared. It was tall, too tall, and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend where no joint should be. Its surface, or skin, was the same luminous fog light, filaments crawling over it like the inner workings of a machine exposed to the air. Where a face should have been was only a smooth oval, but Harris still felt its gaze. The figure leaned closer to the glass, and the frost map shifted again. For a moment, Harris swore it was showing inside the diner. The tables, the people, the very position he stood in, perfectly drawn in ice. The woman who had been muttering stood abruptly. She walked to the door without hesitation. Harris lunged to stop her, but Pierce grabbed his arm. "Wait, look." The fog figure stepped aside as the woman pushed the door open. She walked into the mist and vanished, her form dissolving into a shimmer of blue threads that wove upward and disappeared. Harris turned to Pierce, fury rising. "We can't just let them—" "We don't have a choice," Pierce interrupted. "The circle's almost closed." Through the diner's front window, Harris saw what he meant. The fog wall was sealing, connecting its edges in a perfect ring around the building. Beyond it, the town was gone, replaced with an alien landscape of black spires and a sky rippling in green and violet bands. The air grew colder, sharper, as if it were being drawn toward that other place. The hairs on Harris's arms stood on end. He realized the diner wasn't just surrounded. It was inside whatever space the fog was creating. The countdown began again. 10. The number echoed in Harris's skull like a stone dropped into deep water. Each reverberation seemed to scrape a layer of thought away, leaving the mind raw and exposed. 9. The air in the diner was no longer just cold, it was thin. Breathing felt like pulling air through damp cloth. Harris's lungs ached. The others noticed too. The chatter had stopped, replaced by shallow gasps. A few people pressed napkins or scarves over their mouths, as though instinctively trying to filter something invisible. 8. Pierce was at the window now, tracing the lines in the frost map with a trembling fingertip. The shapes shifted beneath his touch, almost as if reacting. "It's not just showing the diner anymore," he murmured. It's showing a route. 7. Outside, the fog wasn't uniform anymore. It was thinner in one place, about 20 feet to the left of the diner's entrance. Through the gap, Harris thought he saw something solid, a narrow stone arch rising from the alien ground, its surface crawling with faint blue glyphs. The arch seemed to pulse in sync with the countdown. 6. The figure they had seen earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Harris scanned the mist and caught flickers of movement, shapes that didn't quite break the surface of the fog, but swam within it like predators circling prey. 5. A man near the counter suddenly bolted for the door, shoving past Harris. Before anyone could stop him, he yanked it open and sprinted into the thinning patch. He didn't make it to the arch. Nothing intercepted him. He was there one moment, a silhouette in the mist, and the next, his shape unraveled into blue filaments, scattering like embers in water. 4. Pierce looked at Harris, his voice low but urgent. That arch is the only thing here that isn't shifting. If there's a way out, it's through there. 3. The frost map pulsed once more, and now the diner itself was no longer in the center. It was off to the side. At the center of the map was the arch. 2. The fog pressed harder against the windows. The geometry of the frost map bent, stretching toward the thinning spot, as if the world outside was tilting toward that archway. Harris felt the pull too, a subtle gravity urging him forward. 1. The hum cut off. Silence. Then a soft chime, impossibly gentle after all the pounding in his skull. The arch beyond the fog flared with light, bright enough to outline the black spires in the distance. The mist around it peeled back in layers, revealing more of the alien terrain. Shards of obsidian drifting in the air, rivers of liquid fire twisting uphill toward a sky that rippled in colors no human eye should see. Harris tightened his grip on the crowbar. We make a run for it. Pierce's lips twitched into the faintest smile. It's not a run, Harris. It's a crossing. The two men stepped toward the door, the remaining townsfolk watching with hollow-eyed resignation or desperate hope. The frost on the glass rearranged one last time, not into a map, but into a single symbol Harris didn't recognize. It pulsed once, twice. Then the glass cracked right down the middle. Pierce yanked the door open. The cold slammed into them like a wall, and the fog seemed to part, just for them, leading toward the arch. Behind them, the countdown began again. The first step into the fog was like stepping into water. The cold was not just on their skin, it filled their bones, slowed their thoughts. Harris could feel each heartbeat as a separate act of will. The sound of the diner's patrons faded behind them, replaced by a hollow, oceanic hum that seemed to come from all directions at once. The arch loomed ahead, its stone surface veined with light. Up close, Harris could see that the glyphs weren't carved. They were moving, swimming lazily beneath the surface like luminous fish beneath ice. Pierce kept his eyes fixed on it, as if the sight confirmed something he'd suspected all along. Halfway there, Harris looked down. The ground was no longer the asphalt of Main Street. It was a glassy, black surface, perfectly reflective. Yet, in the reflection, they didn't see themselves. Instead, other figures walked beside them, shadow versions, tall and thin, their heads crowned with branching antlers of pale light. The reflections moved in perfect sync with their steps. The air here was dense, heavy with a scent Harris couldn't place, like rain on scorched metal. Every sound was magnified and warped. Their footsteps landed with a deep, bell-like resonance that lingered in the fog. When they reached the arch, Pierce slowed, placing one palm against its surface. The glyphs swirled beneath his hand, coalescing into a spiral. "It's stable," he said, his voice strangely confident. "Step through, and don't look back." Harris hesitated. "What's on the other side?" Pierce's smile was thin. "Another Earth, not our Earth." Before Harris could respond, the fog behind them stirred. Shapes emerged, not fully formed, just outlines in the mist. They were human in height, but their limbs bent at wrong angles, and where their heads should have been were shifting voids that seemed to swallow light. Pierce didn't wait. He stepped through the arch, vanishing as though swallowed by a sheet of rippling water. Harris followed, gripping the crowbar like a talisman. The world changed in an instant. The air was warmer here, but still carried that metallic tang. Above them, the sky was a fractured mirror of their own, shards of pale blue and crimson drifting in a slow whirl. Mountains jutted downward from the sky as if gravity had been reversed. Below, rivers of molten silver carved channels through plains of obsidian sand. Massive structures rose in the distance, but they were not built in any way Harris could understand. They seemed to fold in and out of themselves, their edges vanishing into thin air. Harris turned, expecting to see the arch behind them. It was there, but now it stood alone on a bare hill, the diner and the fog completely gone. Through it, Harris could see only blackness. The glyphs dimmed one by one until the stone was cold and lifeless. Pierce was already walking toward the nearest structure, his pace steady and sure. Harris caught up, his voice sharp. "You've been here before." Pierce didn't deny it. "Once, not for long." "What is this place?" Pierce's gaze swept over the horizon. A version of Earth that branched away from ours before life began. It evolved differently. It doesn't have the same rules. As if to punctuate his words, a shape the size of a house drifted overhead. A massive, jellyfish-like creature, its tendrils trailing light. Harris watched it float silently toward one of the upside-down mountains, where it disappeared into a fissure that seemed to lead nowhere. In the distance, the sound of the countdown began again, but this time it wasn't mechanical. It was a voice, deep, resonant, and speaking in a language Harris couldn't understand. The voice carried through the air like a wave of pressure, making Harris's ribs vibrate. It wasn't just sound, it was inside his head, wrapping around his thoughts, bending them like soft metal. Pierce didn't flinch. "You hear it too," Harris said, his voice tight. Pierce nodded. "It's not speaking to you. Not yet." They moved across the plain, the obsidian sand crunching softly underfoot. Every few hundred steps, Harris saw things jutting out of the ground, long, rib-like arcs of bone, each one taller than a man. Some were fused with the black surface, others looked as if they had been dragged halfway under. "What happened here?" Harris asked. Pierce stepped over a spine the size of a telephone pole. Extinction event, but not like ours. This one didn't leave behind survivors. The molten rivers ahead seemed to glow brighter the closer they came to the structure. From a distance it looked like a tower, but as they approached, Harris saw it was alive. Its surface was covered in pulsing membranes, shifting with each slow breath. Openings appeared and vanished, as if the thing was deciding whether it wanted to let them in. Harris stopped. "That's not a building." "No," Pierce said simply. The voice rolled over them again, louder this time, like an earthquake made of syllables. Harris staggered, clutching his head. In his mind, images burst into being, scenes that weren't his memories. A sky filled with black spirals, cities made of bone and glass, seas boiling under twin moons, and then a face, or something like one, vast, featureless, but watching him. When the vision faded, Harris was on one knee, gasping. Pierce stood over him, unshaken. "You saw it," Pierce said. "What was that?" Harris demanded. Pierce's eyes glimmered with a strange light. "The one that brought me here, the one that opens the way." The structure emitted a deep, throbbing hum. From the sand beneath their feet, faint patterns began to emerge, geometric shapes that shifted when Harris tried to focus on them. They led straight to the structure's base. Pierce began walking again, faster now. It doesn't like to be kept waiting. Harris followed, glancing at the horizon. That's when he saw it, something moving through the haze. It wasn't walking or flying, it was drifting, massive beyond comprehension, its outline breaking and reforming like smoke caught in wind. For a moment, it seemed to be made of the same molten light as the rivers, then it dissolved into darkness. "Tell me we're going back," Harris said, his voice low. Pierce didn't answer. As they reached the base of the structure, it opened, a vertical slit appearing in the membrane, oozing with a viscous, glowing fluid. The air inside shimmered like heat haze. Pierce stepped forward without hesitation. "Once we go in, it will see you too." Harris froze. "And if I don't want it to?" Pierce's expression was unreadable. "Then you shouldn't have followed me through the arch." Behind them, the voice came again, no longer a call but a command. The sound rippled through the plain, and from far off Harris saw multiple shapes stirring in the inverted mountains, beginning to descend. Whatever they were coming fast. Pierce disappeared inside the slit. Harris's choice was no longer between following or not. It was between following or being caught by whatever else lived here. The moment Harris crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The air inside wasn't air at all. It was thick like walking through liquid glass. His breath fogged before him, yet no condensation clung to his skin. Behind him, the slit sealed shut with a sound like wet fabric tearing in reverse. The floor undulated slightly, forcing him to adjust his balance. Beneath its semi-transparent surface, dark shapes moved lazily, like fish in deep water. One brushed against the underside, and Harris jerked back. It wasn't a fish. Pierce moved ahead without pause, the faint glow from the walls painting his outline in shifting blues and golds. "Don't stop," he called over his shoulder. "It notices hesitation." "What does?" Harris asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Pierce didn't answer. The walls seemed to lean inward the further they went, narrowing the path. Veins of light pulsed faster now, matching the rhythm of Harris's heartbeat. Or was it the other way around? At times, the light dimmed to near blackness, and Harris swore he felt something brushing against him in the dark, only for the glow to flare again, revealing empty space. A sound began to build, a low, resonant vibration, deep enough to make his teeth ache. Harris realized it wasn't coming from ahead, but from everywhere. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure, pushing against his thoughts, nudging them toward ideas that weren't his. Images started to bloom in his mind again. An ocean upside down, its waves crashing upward into a sky that bled color. Towers built from spiraling spines, countless doorways, each leading to a different landscape, each guarded by shapes he couldn't fully perceive. And always at the center of those visions, it. He caught only flashes, never the whole form, yet each glimpse carried the same sensation, being seen, measured, and catalogued by something older than language itself. "Pierce," Harris said, voice tight. "Where are we going?" "To the heart," Pierce replied. The corridor widened suddenly into a vast chamber. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into a haze of shimmering air. The floor was a perfect circle, etched with symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves as Harris looked at them. In the center rose a column of light so bright it was almost solid, and suspended within it was something. It looked human at first, a figure standing perfectly still, but as Harris's eyes adjusted, the wrongness emerged. The proportions were slightly off, the joints bent subtly backward, and the skin seemed to ripple like the surface of water disturbed by a pebble. "That's not," Harris began. "It's a crossing shell," Pierce said. "An anchor. You'll need one if you plan to leave." The figure turned its head, slowly, deliberately. Harris's stomach dropped. There were no eyes, yet he knew it was looking at him. The vibration in the chamber spiked, rattling his bones. For an instant, his mind wasn't his own. He saw 1,000 versions of himself, in 1,000 places, each standing exactly where he was now, each being observed by something just beyond the veil of sight. Then the presence withdrew, and Harris staggered forward, gasping. Pierce stepped closer to the column of light. "It's agreed to see you. Few get that far." Harris looked around. "And the ones who don't?" From the shadows at the chamber's edge, movement, dozens of shapes peeling themselves from the walls, tall and angular, their heads tilting unnaturally as they began to close in. Pierce didn't seem alarmed. They go back, but not the way they came. The air around the column was hot and cold at the same time, like standing in the center of a storm where the winds circle but never touch you. The figure inside didn't move, but the surface of its skin shimmered like moonlight on water. Harris took a slow step forward, feeling the vibrations crawl deeper into his skull. The guardians in the shadows shifted their weight in unison, their heads tilting, but none stepped closer. It was as though they were bound to an invisible perimeter around the light. "Touch it," Pierce said softly, his voice almost reverent. "That's how it begins." Harris glanced back at him. Begins what? The seeing. Against every instinct screaming at him, Harris extended his hand. His fingers brushed the surface of the figure, only it wasn't surface at all. It was depth pulling him in. The sensation was like falling through a reflection into the water beneath. The light swallowed him whole. The chamber vanished. He was standing on a cliff of black stone, its edge crumbling into an abyss that stretched forever. Above, 2 suns hung at opposite ends of the sky, one red, one pale gold. Their light bled together in the middle, casting the landscape in strange, shifting hues. Below the cliff, forests of metallic trees swayed without wind. Their leaves were flat hexagonal plates that flashed like mirrors, sending ripples of reflected sunlight dancing across the terrain. Beyond them, towers rose, not built of stone or steel, but of bones. Massive bones, curved and spiraled, some taller than mountains. A voice, not Pierce's, not his own, spoke inside his mind. "You do not belong to one place." The words were not heard so much as imprinted, resonating in his chest. "You are from," Harris began, but the question felt absurd even as it formed. "Another frame of the same weave," the voice replied. "Your earth is one strand. There are others. This is one." Harris turned. The figure from the column now stood beside him, no longer shimmering, but fully formed and fully alien. Its proportions still wavered, as though his eyes couldn't settle on a single version of it. Sometimes it seemed human, other times entirely not. "What is this place?" he asked. A junction, not the only one. Images flooded his mind again. Deserts with skies of liquid blue fire, oceans dotted with islands that breathed, cities crawling on jointed legs across endless plains. He saw doorways in mountains and clouds, in the cracks between raindrops. Some led to familiar worlds, others did not. "Why me?" "Because you followed," the voice said. "Most turn away before they see the seam." Harris looked around again. The air tasted faintly of copper. In the distance, something massive moved, an undulating shape that rose above the tree line before sinking again. "This isn't real," Harris muttered, more to himself than to the figure. The figure tilted its head. "All frames are real. All frames are false. Truth is the crossing." The ground beneath him shuddered. Far off, a tear opened in the sky, blackness spilling through. Within it, Harris glimpsed a version of the chamber he'd left, only this one was empty. The column of light shattered, the walls collapsing inward like something had eaten through reality itself. He staggered back, heart pounding. "I want to go back." The figure studied him for a moment that stretched too long. Then it raised one elongated hand and touched his chest. The world shattered. The cliff, the suns, the towers, all collapsed into shards of light, spinning around him until they became the walls of the chamber once more. He was back in front of the column, breathing hard, sweat running down his back. Pierce was watching him with an expression that was half envy, half fear. "You saw it," he said. "Now you can't unsee it." The sky above the alien city had changed. The fractured shimmer was now awash in deep purples and bruised blues, and new points of light, stars, began to glint in unfamiliar constellations. Harris walked beside the tall figure across the elevated pathway, his eyes constantly drawn to the city below. That was when he saw him again. The human. In the dim light, the man's movements were jerky, urgent. He slipped between narrow openings in the structures, pausing only to glance over his shoulder. For the briefest second, Harris met his gaze. Recognition flared, not because Harris knew him personally, but because the expression was unmistakable. Fear. Harris slowed, and the tall figure kept moving forward. The instant there was enough distance between them, Harris ducked to the side, finding a narrow ramp that spiraled downward into the lower district. The air here was warmer, heavier, with a faint metallic tang. The streets weren't streets at all. They were living channels between walls that flexed almost imperceptibly, as though the city were breathing. Threads of light ran along their surfaces, pulsing in gentle rhythms. Somewhere ahead, footsteps echoed faintly. Harris pressed forward, following the sound. The human figure appeared again, a fleeting glimpse before vanishing around a curve. Harris quickened his pace, weaving through the labyrinth of shifting walls. Occasionally he passed other tall figures, but they paid him no mind, or perhaps they didn't notice him at all. He began to notice something else, The deeper he went, the more the structures seemed damaged. Light veins flickered, and in some areas the walls had split, revealing dark voids beyond. The man finally stopped in an alcove lit by a faint reddish glow. His clothes were tattered, stained with something dark. His beard was uneven, his hair matted. He stared at Harris for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and ragged. "You shouldn't have followed," he said. "You're not supposed to see this part." Harris stepped closer, cautiously. "Who are you?" The man shook his head. "No names, doesn't matter. What matters is you finding the way back before they decide you're worth keeping." "Keeping?" Harris repeated. The man's gaze darted upward toward the fractured sky. "This place isn't what it looks like. It's a mask. The real city is somewhere else. We're just inside the skin of it. And once you're deep enough, it doesn't let go." Before Harris could respond, a sound rippled through the air, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The man froze, eyes wide. "They've noticed you left your guide." He shoved something into Harris's hand. It was small, metallic, and oddly warm, shaped almost like a key, but with no teeth. "If you want to leave," the man hissed, "you'll need to find the breach. It's still here, under the city, but it's not always open." Suddenly, the corridor behind them filled with light, not the soft bioluminescence of the city, but a blinding, concentrated beam. Silhouettes emerged from it, tall and unmoving. The man gave Harris one last look, then bolted into the shadows. Harris instinctively started after him, but the light intensified and his limbs locked as though the very air had solidified. The tall figures moved forward, their patterns flashing rapidly, surrounding him. The last thing Harris saw before everything went black was the small metallic object glowing faintly in his clenched fist. We may never know what happened to Harris after that moment in the alien city. Some claim fragments of his account still exist, smuggled out in cryptic notes and half-burned journal pages. Others believe the entire story is fabrication, a science fiction fever dream wrapped in the language of truth. But history is littered with stories that feel eerily familiar. Travelers who vanish without explanation, people who reappear years later insisting they'd been somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't a dream, yet wasn't our world. Locations that are here one moment and gone the next. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as delusion, hoax, or the product of flawed memory. And yet, the details often overlap. Too strange, too consistent to ignore completely. The key-shaped artifact Harris described, similar objects have been reported in South America, Eastern Europe, and rural Japan, often connected to tales of doors in the air or corridors of light. Could Harris's story be part of a larger pattern? Was he just another in a long line of people who claimed to have slipped between realities? Or was he the unlucky one who wandered too far into something designed to keep what it takes? The answer may never come. And maybe that's the point. Some mysteries survive because they remain unanswered, gnawing at the edges of what we believe is possible. But here's where you come in. The more we share these stories, the more we document, compare, and investigate, the harder they become to erase. So keep asking questions, keep looking at the empty spaces in the map. And if you ever find yourself standing in a place where the air hums, the light bends, and the world feels just slightly wrong, don't ignore it. If you believe Harris's account, share this story. Talk about it. Because somewhere out there, in the skin of a city that isn't ours, he might still be waiting for someone to find the breach again.